listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Have you heard of Pine Gap? It's a place on the outskirts of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, and it's the location of one of the most important US spy bases in the world.
Pine Gap is effectively a spy base that is sort of the eyes and ears of the world.
What goes on at Pine Gap has been shrouded in secrecy for decades, but some of those who are in the know think it makes Australia a nuclear target and possibly complicit in the conflicts happening right now in the Middle East. That fascinating conversation is happening in today's Deep Dive. First though, let's get into today's news headlines with Simon Beaton. It is Thursday, May 16.
Hey Sasha, so a Western Sydney Council meeting last night has seen the reversal of a controversial same-sex parenting book ban that was enacted across all of their libraries earlier this month. The decision took quite a while, 4 hours of heated discussion and debate before the final decision, with 12 councillors in agreement against 2. Councillor Steve Christo had initially proposed the ban, claiming that he had received many complaints from the community, which is predominantly conservative and religious, that the books shouldn't put the issues of sexuality on children. But when I say heated, I don't mean just in the actual council chambers. Here's some audio from the Daily Mail of the protests that went on outside.
Do you realise there's nothing about sex in that book, though?
Yeah, a lot going on there. There were 6 police officers in attendance, as well as a couple of security guards, but hundreds protested both for and against the ban outside on the street.
Yeah, and you might remember, if you're listening to this, we did speak to Councillor Steve Christo last week on The Briefing. That was an interview with co-host Bension Siebert, and he spoke to the councillor about this ban and why he believed in it. And there was a petition in response to the ban that got 42,000 signatures. Now, whether all of those came from local families and community members, we don't know. But there was a lot of anger and questions of how a book about same-sex parenting is sexual, which is what the councillor Steve Christo had been saying, or we don't want to sexualise our kids. So I do think a lot of people will be pleased that this is the outcome of this story. It's created a lot of hurt and pain for the LGBTQIA plus community, and I think they'll be glad to see that ban has been reversed. The Prime Minister of Slovakia has been shot in what officials are calling an attempted assassination. Robert Fico had been leaving a government meeting in the city of Handlova when he was hit by bullets in the abdomen, arm and leg, suffering life-threatening injuries. The 59-year-old was airlifted to hospital and has undergone surgery. His current condition isn't known. A 71-year-old man has been arrested over the shooting. And in a press conference, the incident was labelled by Slovakia's Interior Minister as politically motivated. So, Simon, I went and had a look to see what, I'm the first to admit I don't know much about Slovakian politics, so I went and had a look at what the Prime Minister's politics have been. And it seems that Fico has become increasingly pro-Russian in his rhetoric, which has put him at odds with fellow NATO countries and also drawn criticism from the West. And he was elected last year. During the election campaign, he also vowed not to send weapons to Ukraine. And he has kept that promise so far while in power.
Yeah, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has sent his well wishes. He said that there can be no justification for this monstrous crime. And in a telegram to the Slovak president said that Robert Fico was a courageous and strong-minded man. And then also Joe Biden and the UN have also condemned the violence. A Labor senator has officially broken ranks with the government to label Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide. So Fatima Payman's comments mark the strongest condemnation of Israel by an Australian government representative since the war began.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I ask our Prime Minister and our fellow parliamentarians, how many international rights laws must Israel break for us to say enough?
Yeah, so that audio was from One Path Network, and here's what the Deputy PM, Richard Miles, said in response.
It's not the word I would use, and what we are focused on is using our advocacy towards bringing this this tragedy to an end.
Yeah, so that was Miles speaking on the ABC there. Payman was elected to the Senate in 2022, and what she's calling for from the government is for Australia to end trade with Israel, implement sanctions and immediately recognise a Palestinian state. I want to touch on the phrase she used at the start of the grab, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That phrase is seen by some to be anti-Semitic. Critics say it calls for the wiping out of Israel and Israeli Jews, and we recently heard Prime Minister Anthony Albanese make comments against that, saying that people don't understand what it actually means when they're chanting it. And look, we've also seen an escalation in protests against the war in Gaza right around Australia. There seems to be a bit of a ramping up of action. So we know there's a number of university encampments, and at the ANU campus, which is in Canberra, several people there claim to have been asked to leave by the university after complaints from other students of threatening behaviour. The uni has not confirmed this request, just that they had a meeting with the student protesters. In Melbourne, Melbourne uni students protested in the streets yesterday as well. The Deputy Premier's electoral office was painted red, and there were words splashed on his office that said, blood is on your hands. And the ABC's offices in Southbank were also vandalised, and there were protests in Sydney's CBD last night as well. So it does feel like there's a bit of a ramping up of action here at home in Australia in response.
And finally, Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, has demanded the National Gallery of Australia remove a portrait of her that you could call unflattering. The artwork is part of an exhibition by Archibald winner Vincent Namatjira. There are reports a number of associates of her mining company, Hancock Prospecting, have made complaints too, accusing the NGA of doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party by displaying Rinehart's image in an unflattering way.
Yeah, the NGA has welcomed debate and dialogue on its art, choosing not to remove the painting. Now, this exhibition does include portraits of other high-profile people. We've got Julia Gillard, Scott Morrison, Kathy Freeman, Adam Goodes among them, and they're all depicted in this same way. It's kind of like almost childlike, like it's not flattering.
They're not flattering.
Yeah, but also it's art. That's the exact point. And look, speaking of portraits, a new one of King Charles has been unveiled, and this is the first official portrait of him since his coronation in terms of painting portrait, not image. Yeah. So it's pretty modern by royal standards. I'd encourage anyone listening, when they get a chance, to go have a look at it and form their own view. But the description that I read said the king is depicted wearing the uniform of the Welsh Guards. He has his sword in hand, and he's against this fiery red background that appears to almost swallow him whole, as a butterfly looks like it's about to land on his shoulder. We've both had a look at it this morning, Simon.
Yeah.
I don't know. It feels very stirring, I suppose. And that's just not a word I associate with King Charles.
With King Charles? Look, I love the butterfly. I think that's the perfect little touch there. I also do love on TikTok how people are saying that it's quite hellish and fiery. So a great time there.
It's an interesting one for a royal painting. But as we know, King Charles likes to be the modern monarch. He's painted himself, pardon the pun, in this light. So maybe that's what he was going for with this exciting new portrait that's been unveiled. Hey, Simon, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we're getting into our deep dive on Pine Gap, what's going on there, and why it could make Australia complicit in conflicts happening right now in the Middle East. Sometimes living in Australia feels like you're a million miles away from the war and terror that goes on overseas. We have, of course, been drawn into many conflicts through international alliances, but it rarely feels like danger is right on our doorstep. Unfortunately, today we're shattering that illusion. Today, we're talking about what goes on at Pine Gap, a blip on the map about 18 k's southwest of Alice Springs. It's the location of a joint venture between Australia and the United States that oversees satellite intelligence gathering and surveillance. In other words, it's a spy base. It's in fact been referred to as the most important spy base outside of the United States. For a long time, we didn't know what was happening at Pine Gap as the government sought to keep it from the public, even lying initially about what it was. And even today, the activities and happenings at the base are kept very tightly under wraps. Now there are fears that spies at Pine Gap may be eavesdropping on the Middle East and passing critical information on to the Israeli Defence Force.
Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
Free Palestine!
We have chosen to block the road to Pine Gap US military facility because of their direct involvement in supporting the Israeli genocide of Palestinian people.
Shame.
Shame. Palestinian civilians.
Shame.
Palestinian children.
Shame.
Hospitals.
Shame.
Convoys.
Shame.
Ambulances.
Here to talk about that and what it means is Alex Barwick. She's an Alice Springs journalist and host of the new ABC podcast Spies in the Outback. Alex, thanks for joining us today. To start us off, can you explain what is happening right now at Pine Gap?
That's a huge question, Sasha. There is so much happening at Pine Gap, and having sort of deep dived into it over the past few months, you just realise how vast the reach is of this place. Pine Gap is effectively a spy base on the fringes of Alice Springs. That is sort of the eyes and ears of the world. A huge amount of surveillance is going on, watching and listening and collecting intelligence everywhere across the Middle East, across Europe, across China, Russia. And it's run jointly between the US government and the Australian government. It looks quite extraordinary in the landscape. You really can only see it when you fly in and out of Alice Springs. It's this huge group of sort of oversized golf ball shaped looking radomes that cover listening antenna. And it's those antenna that are part of what's the Pine Gap ground station, effectively controlling and communicating with a series of satellites that do all of that intelligence gathering across an enormous part of the globe.
Why Pine Gap? Why this spot 18 k's southwest of Alice Springs?
Yeah, look, I think whoever thought it up it was a stroke of genius because it is so hidden. It's really hidden in a valley. And it was set up there in the Cold War by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. They wanted an edge over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. They wanted to be able to listen to what was going on. They wanted to see what was going on, particularly around the Soviet Union missile development program. And this was a great spot geographically. There wasn't a lot of electronic interference. I think any Soviet spooks that were sort of around would have been spotted quite easily in a small outback town like Alice Springs. And so it was considered the perfect place. And there's a bizarre story actually about 4 men, some of them CIA officers, cracking some Australian wine over the Arundel land that was taken to build this spy base. But of course it was actually sold on a lie. It was sold as a space research facility for quite a long time. So the locals in Alice Springs were, again, no social media back then. They were just told, hey, great news, big development coming. You're going to get a space research facility. And, space was really sexy back then. So that was the sell. And then over the years, the truth has sort of slowly come out as far as, it can, because there is still so much secrecy around this place.
Yeah. So how did you start your investigation into finding out more about kind of what's happening at Pine Gap now, and tell me about what you found out in the course of your investigation?
I remember so clearly, Sasha, first moving to Alice Springs 16 years ago, not really knowing anything about Pine Gap, but there were just little moments which created real curiosity for me. A lot of American candy on the shelves, Halloween celebrated enormously. And then you would start to meet people who would say, I work at the base. So Pine Gap is often referred to as the base locally. And when you sort of said, what do you do at the base? Often they would say, I'm a gardener. And that's sort of become an in-joke in Alice Springs. It's kind of ironic given it's quite hard to garden out here in the desert. But they'd say they were a gardener, and that just meant really no more questions, thanks. I work at the base. And really, that's the social norm. People just don't ask. And I think over the years, for me, that just increasingly was a curiosity, but then almost a bit of an unease. And then a local author and journalist, Kieran Finane, wrote a book called Peace Crimes, and it followed the journey and trial of a group called the Peace Pilgrims who trespassed into Pine Gap in 2016. They were really concerned that Pine Gap had a really key role in the war on terror. And that book really raised a lot of questions around, well, what does this potentially make Australia complicit in?
The argument, and rightly so, is around, the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. There's anger over who is sending weapons to Israel, who is supplying these weapons that are killing civilians in such big numbers. Now, I tried to kind of find this out in a recent episode, and the question around weapons in Australia is kind of shady. We don't really know. But there are genuine fears that in Pine Gap or at Pine Gap, spying is happening that could mean Australia is complicit in the conflict in Gaza. Explain to us how.
Yeah, look, these are really serious claims. The road out to Pine Gap has now been closed twice for hours by groups of protesters who say they believe the intelligence from Pine Gap is being supplied to Israel and being used in Gaza. It's a really serious claim, and that makes Australia complicit in really serious business. Right now, it is almost impossible to find really concrete evidence that a piece of intelligence from Pine Gap has been given to Israel and has been used to target a Palestinian. We can't see the evidence for that. But it is worth asking really big questions around what the intelligence is being used for, because the things that we do know are that there is evidence that in 2013, the National Security Agency, which is one of the key agencies working at Pine Gap, did have an intelligence sharing arrangement with Israel. We know that for certain. What we also know for certain, and this is from a former NSA, National Security Agency worker at Pine Gap over almost 20 years, that's David Rosenberg, he has confirmed that certainly Pine Gap is consistently surveilling the Middle East, that this war would be of significant interest to America. I mean, he very much supports what's happening at Pine Gap, and he would argue that the aim of Pine Gap and the intelligence that it uses is all about minimising loss of life. And I think what's hard in all of this is that the Australian government simply doesn't comment on Pine Gap. It hasn't historically, and it continues not to. And obviously I've been asking a lot of questions, as have others, about what intelligence gathered at Pine Gap is being used for right now. And it's just silent. So we don't know. But you have international human rights lawyers like Sharon O'Meary, KC, saying, if we're a mature democracy, we should be able to ask these questions and we should be able to get answers from the Australian government.
Look, there is a fear of a wider war in the Middle East that could spread from what essentially began as Hamas versus Israel. If we're providing intelligence to someone's enemy, does that put us, and specifically Pine Gap, at risk of foreign attacks then?
It's worth taking a look at what's been the thinking on this over many decades. If you go back to the Cold War, there were so many people protesting Pine Gap specifically around the fact that they saw it as a nuclear target. Now, in the 1980s, the then Labor Foreign Defence Minister Kim Beazley, who is a big supporter of Pine Gap, he said on the record, yes, Pine Gap makes us a nuclear target. Now, he said it's worth it though. He said this place is crucial for peace and stability in the Western world. He still stands by that. He's not alone. But there were so many others saying, no, look, it puts us in the crosshairs. If we fast forward now, you talk to experts in the field, for example, Professor Richard Tanter from Melbourne University, who has spent so much of his professional life looking at Pine Gap at its increased capability, because of course it is constantly expanding. He says it continues to be a nuclear target. And he also believes, because how tightly Australia is with the United States in terms of its military partnership, this is the jewel in the crown of that military alliance. And he believes that it makes Australia and Alice Springs and Buntua a nuclear target more than ever.
You mentioned the Pine Gap pilgrims and people who have been aware of what is happening at Pine Gap for a long time and who have protested. But I've got to say, I don't think much of it has broken through the mainstream. Do you think more people would be protesting if they knew what you just said and had a better idea of what was actually happening at Pine Gap?
It's interesting to see during the 80s, The protests were absolutely enormous. So I think Pine Gap was very much on people's, the nation's conscience. That was a big period of protest more broadly, but there were just thousands of Australians who travelled out here to protest the base. What we've seen from then till now is a sort of a roller coaster of interest. There are times when Pine Gap comes back into the national spotlight and then it does seem to disappear away. And I think a part of that is actually the fact that it is located on the fringe of this outback town. Certainly, one of the key issues that is important in this is that now if you trespass on the base, the legislation that is used to prosecute you is really serious. It's more serious than it was back in the 80s. So it's a piece of federal legislation, the Defence Special Undertakings Act 1952. It comes with a maximum penalty of 7 years imprisonment. Now, I should say no jail time has ever been given, but it's just getting increasingly serious.
Alex Barwick, thank you so much for talking to us today and for sharing what you've learned as you've investigated Pine Gap.
Great to talk to you, Sasha.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is all for today. Before you go, though, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you do want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. That's LISTNR. I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.
Listener.